So in the last video we talked about a little bit of the historical and social context of the Victorian period, and now we're going to talk about some main themes going on in this period. So there's a lot of social discussion and conversation happening, but these are some of the main ones or main ideas that they were circling around, and some of them we kind of touched on briefly already, but I just want to make sure you kind of can see these as we're reading to look for them through what you will read for class. So, literacy in education of this period, it's by the end of the period, literacy is almost universal for all citizens. And this happens because of a couple of different parts that pop up during this period. So in 1870, the government authorizes basically the equivalent of public schools for elementary age children. So younger students can now get education, and it's public, so you don't have to only be part of the wealthy to be able to attend. By 1880, you have compulsory education until the age of 10 established. So not only do we start with public schools, but now we're adding in everyone has to attend school until at least 10. And then by 1890, education is absolutely free for all people. It also helps during this time that the church loses its control of education. So previously it had been from the elementary level up through collegiate. The Church of England had a say in curriculum and how it was going to work and what you could study. And in 1890 they lose that. Excuse me, not in 1890, but like in this period they lose that control. So literacy is going to skyrocket for all male, female, working class through upper class, which is really important. There's also some other cool educational things happening, like women can, by the end of the period, are able to start attending and earning degrees at universities, which is a huge plus, and they can start getting an education outside of just finishing school. So it's not just like people should be able to read, it's what are they studying and who and how and where can they study. You also will see discussions related to gender, sexuality, and domestic ideology. There can be this lingering belief that the Victorians were very prudish. They kind of like didn't talk about sexuality and stuff like that, and it's not completely true. It kind of depends on the social class and like who you're talking about. But in this period, you'll notice that there's kind of a prevailing belief that there's two separate spheres of influence for men and women. So women should be the private sphere of life. That means they're all about docility, goodness. They're maternally compassionate. So we get our goodness, our kindness, and compassion from them, whereas the men are our public sphere, where we can find bravery, I should say bravery, strength, leadership from them. And so these two spheres should balance each other out. But that doesn't mean we're not questioning gender for both male and female, and what does that look like, and what are societal expectations for them. Women are pushing for their rights, so by the end of this period, they can finally get divorced. Previously, they had to have both adultery and cruelty, bigamy, incest, or bestiality to earn a divorce. By the end of this period, that's going to change through some different laws. Married women could start being in control of their own property. So there's a lot of change going on for women, but that's not the only conversation happening in the Victorian period. And if you ignore the other realm of the other gender and domestic ideology, like there's a rich discussion you're missing. Poverty, unrest, and social criticism. I talked a lot about that in the last video, so I'm just going to note that there's a massive poverty gap. They're very unsanitary and dangerous areas where most of the working class and lower classes would have to live, which led to a lot of ill health. And so writers are really focusing on bringing to light issues that are in this theme, which should not be surprising. It's also a period of doubt, self-reflection, and romanticisms. So I already mentioned that we're kind of a little bit anxious. We're like sad to see our ways change, and yet at the same time we're looking forward to the future. There's a lot of reflection, but this massive excess is causing a lot of introspection. We feel like revolution could happen everywhere, including the fact that evolution is being discussed, which completely shakes the foundation of the way people approached and viewed things scientifically in a way, and it changes the religious beliefs that we just were clinging to. So everything feels uncertain, and we're reflecting, and some of us want to cling to that idea of romanticism, but some of us are like, no, we need to be more you know, we need to break from that and be more realistic. And so there's a lot of like questioning of oneself and figuring out, what does this mean? So in art, what does that look like? So art is going to branch out and try different things. And there's two main paths. We're going to continue on with the romantic idea of clinging to the medieval period and those ideas and how they approach things, and a rosy looking back to the past. Or we're just going to do art for art's sake. Like, I just want to do my art. Like, there's no like reason to have to do it. Like, art is just art, which is really cool because we see that a lot in art today. So like I said, the Victorian period is really going to push things that we're used to in this 21st century. Progress, science, and colonial expansion. You know, I told you we had the Great Exhibition in 1851, where we had the World Fair in London at the Crystal Palace, trying to show off commerce and industry, but also different inventions. So yes, science is causing us issues, but we're also using as a rationale for our expansion. Darwinism is now going to be applied also to society. So it's not just in the animals realm. It's going to be like, this is how society also fixes it. These are some of the biggest contributions to modern society in terms of progress, science, and colonial expansion, because in this 70-ish period, year period, it changes more than it did from William the Conqueror to William the Fourth. So hundreds of years had nowhere near the amount of change that this just under 70-year period had in terms of progress and expansion in science. So yes, things are improving. It's great. But like, they do feel sometimes that it's changing too fast for them to understand and keep up. So those are themes we're seeing being discussed in society, which means we're going to see them in literature. But what was the literature of the period? What were people reading and enjoying, and how are they engaging with it? And honestly, like, they're engaging with things of all kinds. I'm sometimes in periods and be like, well, maybe theater wasn't very popular, but poems were. Or like, you know, there's like a give and take in this period. It's like across the board, all the things are thriving, which matches the energy of the period. So you had short fiction and novels. So this is mainly just the fiction, whether it's short or not. Periodicals became the most significant development of the period in literary culture, because magazines were available to almost every taste. Anyone could find anything to read if they wanted. In the first 30 years of this period, for example, 170 new periodicals started in London. So in 30 years, we had 170 just magazines, periodicals, just based out of London. So it tells you it's growing, and all people could find writings on almost any taste. Because magazines were so popular and periodicals were so popular, they had a lot of power and influence in terms of like public affairs, social affairs, but they also had the power to make or break literary reputations based off their reviews. So that's kind of a new stressor for writers as well. The middle class, as they're reading, anything they're reading, they do expect that they can both be delighted and instructed while illuminating social problems and and the story should feel continuous with the lived world. So it needs to entertain us. It needs to also instruct us. It needs to talk about social issues, and it needs to feel like we could really live in this world in your book. That's a lot to expect. And for a long time, writers do go along with that just because they want to make money and it's what's appealing to people. By the end of the period, that will change. We will lose that feeling of we have to play into that middle class expectation. What's unique in this period is, even though we now read these novels that would have been published in as one thing, at the time they would have been published in serial form, meaning you had short installments that would last a year, maybe more, so you'd get a little bit each time, not a year between them, just like spread through the year, which allows for discussion and reflection between readings. And it also promotes this like community of readers because everybody's able to read about it and talk about it. So think about it as like the newest, I don't know, it's not quite like a TikTok trend, but like, you know, when there's a new TikTok trend, everybody's talking about it and doing it. And then there's a new one. So kind of the same thing with this, like serial came out, everyone's talking about it. Ooh, here's the next one. We're going to talk about it. Novels are the true literary jewel of this period. It is the preeminent literary triumph, as your textbook will say. So yes, periodicals are huge development, but novels are the crowning jewel from looking back at the period. We are focusing on reality and developing the middle class in these books. And the protagonist is trying to define their role in society, whether it's in love, their position, they want an adequate life. So caught up in that idea of fitting into society. Women authors are also going to be major players. They're going to focus on that private sphere. However, since things have to be realistic, as novels typically deal with, where's your place in society? Good place for women to talk about as they're just trying to define their roles, and is a good vehicle for heroines to try to figure it out. In novels, you have a 2-for-1. You can be entertained and discuss social issues, which lets the mass, not just the educated elite, but the general mass can discuss social issues. And I did pull this one quote that I want you to see from your textbook. What is a novel if not a conviction of our fellow man's existence strong enough to take upon itself a form of imagined life clearer than reality, and whose accumulated verisimilitude of selected episodes put to shame the pride of documentary history, aka a novel should convict people because they can present a problem more clearly and with more emotional impact. Poetry was loved at this time. Victorians felt like poetry was their highest pinnacle, and it was completely integrated in all parts of life because it was just printed everywhere and you could easily access it. So they really loved it. There are some developments that go on in poetry, more narrative tellings. They're experimenting with character and perspective. What is an appropriate topic for poetry, so that art for art's sake versus what's proper or not. But it's going to feel a little less imaginative when compared to the romantics. They're trying to pull from that a little bit. Sometimes you see it in monologues. They did develop lyric, an important achievement, which is a lyric poem with a narrator who has an ironically distant voice from the author. So trying to separate the speaker in the poem, the narrator of the poem, from the author itself. There are still some shared traits between all these poetry. They're all very pictorial. They all like to use sound, whether for meaning or just symbolically. They all are looking at psychology, but they start moving around. And by the end of the period, poets wanted to be distanced from the public and feel special, so they get that we're Bohemian rebel kind of feel that we might recognize from the early modern period. Women are still rejected as poetry writers, so that's, kind of a bummer as well. So with our prose writings, their goal of prose, so nonfiction, is to instruct. At this time, being able to argue and persuade people is really important. So they wanted you to share their values and beliefs. It's a very Victorian form where they're because of this. They want to help shape belief in the chaotic time. And your textbook also points out that the writers of prose, their goal is to claim a place for literature in a scientific and materialistic world. So we want to instruct, we want people to learn from this and help them become better arguers, but also trust our view of society. And then lastly, the drama of theater. Even though we don't pay much attention to it as modern scholars, which is sad because there's a lot of great theater at this time, it was flourishing at this time. The number of theaters more than double in this period. So in 1850 and 1860, the number of theaters doubled. By the middle of the 60s, you could find 150,000 people attending the theater on one day in London alone, and that came from your Norton anthology. I've listed for you all these different types of entertainments that that would be found on the stage. So people were going and loving the entertainment, but by the end of the period, theater is going to start doing what we call problem plays to discuss social issues, and some writers like Oscar Wilde, who we will read, are using theater to write comedy that targets the Victorian pretense and hypocrisy. So beginning of the period, it's thriving because of the entertainment aspect. By the end of the period, it's thriving because people are enjoying the social commentary of it. So there's a lot to unpack in this period, and we'll get to do a little bit of that, and I hope you enjoy it.